Hi, everybody. My name is Terry Weber. I'm with UK Elder Care, and today I would love to introduce Esther Hurlburt. She is with Parent Care Kentucky, and she is a geriatric care manager. She's been doing this for a long time and knows all the ins and outs of what care options are out there for us so we can help our older folks, our loved ones. How about that? I think so. Anyhow, I'm just going to let Esther take it because I think she's got a lot to tell us today, and I think there's a lot we can learn. Thank you.
Good to see you, Terry. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm Esther Hurlburt, and I have been doing this for 25 years. And I started my private practice as a geriatric care manager about 25 years ago or more, because I was going back and forth to Montana taking care of my folks. And it wasn't that I minded, it wasn't that I minded helping them, but it certainly didn't fall into the vacation category. All of those trips that I made. And one day I said to myself, I pay somebody who doesn't have an iron in the fire to help me get a plan for my parents together. Because when I'd call them and say, how you doing? They'd say, oh, we're fine. And I'd think, no, you're not. No, and so, we had this back and forth for a while. Well, we're fine, you don't need to worry. And I said, well, of course I worry. I'm your daughter. I mean, that's in my DNA to worry about you. So I had this idea. I said, well, if I'm an adult child, worried about my parents, certainly there are other adult children in the same boat I am. So I launched Parent Care about 25 years ago. So the majority of my clients are adult children who live elsewhere, although every now and then they live in the same town. The benefits of having a geriatric care manager is that I can be objective and give objective information. And so if somebody wants to be mad, they can be mad at me because I'm the messenger with this information rather than a direct family person that, wants to come in and then the parents being mad at their family for making recommendations. So I can be that neutral, objective party. But over the past 25 years, I've changed the way I do assessments to a significant degree because what I've learned and what the data show really clearly is that primary caregivers, that's probably most of you all in the listening audience here, primary caregivers needs count. And I have the line, and I always tell my families, the needs of the primary caregiver are every bit as important as the needs of the care receiver. Because if anything happens to the primary caregiver, the care receiver is the first one to suffer. So I try to construct plans that will meet the needs so the primary caregiver can have their own life, have a sense of their own autonomy, that the whole plan isn't just about the care receiver, but the plan is about the needs of both care receiver and caregiver. And I call it the 67% rule. And these data are a bit dated, but I think they're probably pretty accurate. And I don't say this to scare people, but I imagine those of you listening know this, that they call it the 67% rule because the data show that primary caregivers have a 67% greater chance of death or disability secondary to caregiver stress than non-primary caregivers of the same age. So it only makes sense to take care of the primary caregivers so the care receiver can get the care they need. So that's how I like to approach, this planning. In particular, today, we're going to be talking about the different kinds of licensure and the different ways of caring places for care for an older adult. So if you have your handouts, the first the first, there are several options. There is care at home. There's care at a facility. And so there's care at home and care in a facility, and within both of those groups there are multiple choices. Care at home, there you can have home health care from a variety of agencies, and the home health care usually is a nurse and some social work, or maybe a social worker, occupational or physical therapist, perhaps a home care aide. But home health care is usually time limited, and it's reserved pretty much for people with long-term chronic health problems. And so I caution families that while it might be available, it's not good for the long haul, and it's not like somebody comes in and stays at your house to care for your parent. There's also care by a family member, and that's been happening for years and years. But as I look at the screen today, I see that the majority of you on the screen are women. And what's happened over the years, that women who have left the workforce to take care of a primary, to take care of a parent, those women suffer financial loss in the long term because they don't pay into Social Security as long, and they don't get the work credits that they need for Social Security as long. So in the long term, the women have less to live on for the long haul than do men. So I would like to see some reform in that primary caregivers can earn the credits that they need in order to be compensated, at least in some manner. There are Medicaid waivers, and there are a number of them, and I will be real frank with you, that is not my forte. It's kind of a complicated system of getting a Medicaid waiver for care at home, and Medicaid is the public assistance. That a caregiver can come in to help with activities of daily living, help somebody, get out of bed, shower, get their, day organized, prepare a meal, leave it for them to eat later. But again, under those waivers, those people who come in to help are time limited. Limited in the number of hours they can be available per day. So it's not 24/7 care at home. In-home care, whether you use private caregivers, like from an agency, and there are an abundance of agencies, senior helpers, care at home, extra care. They're called personal service agencies. They're in abundance. They all pretty much have the same workforce. They're competing for the same workforce. So you have the private, or you have the agencies. When you have an agency, they are the employer of they're the employer of the worker, and they provide workers' compensation and do all the payroll and timekeeping and those kinds of things. Or you can have private caregivers, and we'll get into this a little bit more in a bit, or you can have private caregivers that you can hire privately, and if it's done correctly, the family should become the employer, pay all the payroll, taxes. I highly encourage anybody at home that has private caregivers to have work comp insurance, because many homeowners insurance do not cover caregiving staff for injuries. And so the last thing you want is to have a private caregiver in your home get a back injury and then you not be adequately covered for a work-related injury. So the care at home can be complicated, because not only do you manage the care and the care plan for the aging parent, but you also end up managing staff. It's doable, but on a 24/7 basis, it can be complicated. what we do know, and people, you know, and it wouldn't surprise me if you've said this, and I hear it a lot, is, you know, I want to stay at home as long as possible, you know, and that's a real relative kind of wish, because what's the benchmark for moving? One of the things we know for certain is that at least 24/7 care, and sometimes even 12 hours of care a day, depending on how you structure it, it can be 2 to 3 times more expensive than care in a facility. People think that care at home is less expensive, but if it's done correctly, it can be 2 to 3 times more expensive. You can expect to pay, in today's prices now, even during COVID, because the cost of care went up for caregivers, you can expect to pay a minimum of $21 an hour for a non-licensed, non-medical caregiver. They can come in and help with a bath or leave a meal, and do some personal care, but they're not medically trained, and you can expect to pay at least $21 an hour. So you do the math, you do that math, and you find that the cost per month for care at home on a 24/7 basis can cost $10,000 or $12,000. And that's at a minimum. And then you add in work comp insurance, payroll taxes, and all of that. So it can be very, very expensive. So I encourage people, if they're considering care at home, to look very carefully at the options. To look very carefully at those options, to find that if it's truly affordable. I'm going to pardon myself for just a second while I shut the door, because the neighbor decided to mow his lawn. I'll be right back. Pardon me. And at the end here, as I move through this outline, write down your questions and we can discuss those questions when we get to the end. So then, in terms of facility care, in Lexington and in Kentucky, there are a variety of options. And Kentucky's kind of odd in how they license facilities. There are a few misnomers about what some of the licensure designations mean. So we'll talk about that as well. But let's start with the independent or retirement living. Excuse me. The independent is a description of licensure to describe the facility or the agency, rather than a description of the resident's abilities. Does that make sense? So the resident might not be totally independent, but the facility is licensed as an independent living facility. And these are the retirement communities, that offer meals and transportation and a social life and on-site entertainment in a wide variety of places. Facilities, particularly in Lexington, would be like the Lafayette, Richmond Place, Legacy Reserve at Fritz Farm. There are several in Lexington that are considered Mayfair Manor, that are retirement facilities. It always makes me chuckle that they're licensed as, quote, independent facilities, when indeed, I think it's more of a luxury than it is a matter of dependence. I mean, if you have somebody do your housekeeping, cook your meals, give you rides, I think that's a luxury rather than a description of dependency. But if you're looking at this strictly from a matter of cost, people are sometimes surprised to find that depending on the bells and whistles and the type of retirement community you choose, it can actually be less expensive than living at home and maintaining your own home. Because if you add in, the cost of your food and your cost of your property taxes and lawn care and mortgage and homeowners insurance and all of those things, if you do a really careful budget analysis, it's not unusual to find that living at home or living in a retirement community can actually be less expensive. People might think, oh my God, it costs $5,000 to live there, or whatever. And when they do the cost analysis, they find out that it's more affordable than they think it might be. So look at the bells and whistles. Some are more affordable than others. They don't have as many bells and whistles. They're not as pretty, but they're certainly affordable. So we have that independent and retirement community. Now here's something that you need to consider very carefully. In Kentucky, there are two designations for facilities that are very much alike, but there's a big difference. There's assisted living and there's personal care. We don't use the nomenclature personal care very much. We toss out the word assisted living quite a bit. And what that means is you have somebody to help you with, say, bathing, dressing, getting out of bed in the morning, odds and ends of little tasks in assisted living that come as the package deal. Assisted living by licensure in Kentucky is a non-medical facility. They don't offer any medical care at all. They don't have a nurse on, they're not required to have a nurse on duty. They can do a variety of things to help an individual, but they are not licensed as a medical facility. And they don't provide any kind of, say, hands-on nursing care or interventions. But their services might be as listed. They might do medication reminders. But medication reminders are very different than medication management. They can send somebody in to help your parent and point to a box, that's already set up with the medications in it for specific times a day and say, don't forget to take your medicines. But they can't administer medicines out of boxes, out of individual containers, and they can't make any determination, and they're not allowed to make a determination of when, say, a PRN or as an needed medication is required. So there's no medication management, there are medication reminders. I'm a nurse, and we look at medication management really, really carefully. So if your parent or loved one has a more complex medical problem or medication management, they might not be well served in an assisted living facility. For instance, in assisted living facilities, if somebody gets a head cold or a sinus infection or a urinary tract infection, there's no one there to call that person's doctor and say, I need a prescription, and have it set in and go ahead and administer the medication coming from the pharmacy. They can't do that because they're non-medical. They can do abundance of other things, and there are an abundance of really lovely assisted living facilities available throughout the state that meet many people's needs. But that's something that you need to carefully consider as you're looking at the licensure. In assisted living, like retirement living, can be quite affordable if you do the math. Once you include the meals and the housekeeping and those kinds of things, and subtract out the cost of care that it would cost you to live at home, you'd find that they're probably financially less expensive than care at home. And many of the assisted living facilities now do have what they call dementia or memory care. They're usually secured facilities, so people can't elope, or they have specific designation for and training in how to deal with people with dementia. So that's what assisted living means in Kentucky. Very, very much like assisted living is a licensure designation called personal care. And here's the trick, because people are so confused about it. Sometimes even on the personal care facilities websites, they'll talk about assisted living because that's the language people are used to hearing. But an important thing to consider is that personal care is a medical model, and it's actually licensed and supervised by the Office of the Inspector General. And they're under much tighter restrictions about the medical care they can provide and how they can provide it. Services are very, very much like assisted living. But the critical difference is there has to be a nurse on duty for at least 8 hours a day. Most facilities now have nurses available 24/7, depending on the facility. But they can do medication management, okay? They can make a determination and administer medications that aren't in that specific box, and it's more than reminders, but it can be more of an assessment of need. They can call home health or people to come in to do x-rays and lab work and get that ordered through a physician. They can call your physician and say, your mom, Lois has what appears to be a urinary tract infection. Can we get some labs in here, and can you order something? They can help you coordinate all that. By cost, personal care is somewhat more expensive than assisted living, but because the medical care is there and they can do more hands-on things, it's typically worth it if the resident has a little bit more complex medical need. For instance, in assisted living, they can go over and turn on an oxygen concentrator. Okay, they can turn the machine on, but they can't adjust the liters per minute of the amount of oxygen somebody gets. For instance, somebody goes in and fiddles with all of the switches or whatever. They can't do that, or they're not supposed to do that by law in assisted living. In personal care, they can do that. Assisted living, they can't do. Some of them are not allowed to do dressing changes. So somebody might have some kind of a wound or non-complex kind of wound care. They can't do that in assisted living. Somebody else has to come in to do that care. In personal care, by license, they can. So that's the critical difference in the two. So depending on the needs of the resident, that's a really critical question to ask. What is the difference? Are you licensed as personal care or as assisted living? And a caveat here is, there's huge competition in facilities here. There's huge competition for residents. Sometimes I hear from assisted living, well, we can do that, or you can do that, but you can do that under the contingencies that you hire somebody else to come in. Okay, so be very careful in that determination, in that designation, assisted living, personal care. I typically, unless it's not complex at all and people just need a very modest amount of care, they can direct their own care, they just can't physically manage their care, I usually recommend that families seriously consider personal care over assisted living. There are contingencies, but keep that in mind. Also know that in personal care and assisted living, that there comes a time, most of the admission criteria are that the person needs to be able to transfer with minimal help of one person. So in order to get on and off the toilet or from their recliner into their wheelchair, they have to be able, for a bed into wheelchair, they need to be able to transfer with the minimal help of one person. If they get too medically complex, or they require the help of more than one person to transfer, that's oftentimes the cutoff by licensure of when the resident can stay in that facility, unless you hire somebody else to come in separately to perform those tasks. So there's that line, if they're progressing and they're kind of teetering on needing skilled care versus personal care or assisted living, that if you have to hire extra person to come in, your costs automatically go up because you're paying for the facility and their care in addition to private caregivers. And I can answer specific questions in just a bit here. So any of that extensive hands-on care you're going to pay extra for, and that's going to directly affect your cost. The cost of assisted living and personal care varies very widely depending on the bells and whistles. You know, there are some very luxurious personal care facilities that look like, you know, luxury hotels. You know, they have lovely dining areas and all kinds of different bells and whistles. Now, of concern here is that Medicaid will not pay for personal care and will not pay for assisted living. Medicaid is public assisting. There are some personal care homes that are designated to people on Medicaid, on assisted living, or I mean on you know, Medicaid with supported living, but those personal care homes provide a very, very basic level of care. So you're looking at, you know, private pay, I'd say anywhere between $5,000 and $6,000 a month, depending on the bells and whistles. So assisted living and personal care, good options for older people that can either direct their own care or are medically fragile enough that they, you know, that they need some additional services in terms of physical care. Much beyond that, then you're moving into skilled nursing care. And that's for somebody that requires 24/7 care for medically complex problems, or their dementia or physical function has declined, that it requires 24/7 care from more than one caregiver, and skilled nursing intervention. People often mistake thinking that Medicare will pay for nursing home care and skilled care, and Medicare will not do that. Medicare will pay for rehabilitation in a nursing home, in their rehab unit, depending on the policy now. Medicare's changed a bit, for up to 100 days. But after that, Medicare will not pay for skilled nursing. Medicaid, or public assistance, will pay for skilled nursing if you can demonstrate that you're indigent and you require Medicaid to pay the cover of the nursing home care. If paying privately, again, depending on the facility, you're looking at $9,000 to $10,000 a month, again, depending on the facility and the bells and whistles. So nursing home care, skilled nursing care is expensive. Just some general things to consider, and then I want to open it up to discussion. Is that I hear this time and time again from families, and I think it's mostly generated from the aging parent, is I'll wait until the time comes. Well, when do we know when the time comes? Because if you wait until the time comes, I've learned you've waited too long. Because if you plan ahead and say, I am ready to move when I'm relatively healthy, when I can direct my own care, when I can get acquainted with other people, when I have more of the cognitive and physical ability to adapt to a new situation, it is much easier to move and get settled before the time comes, because then you have a choice. Then you have the choice of facilities. You have the choice of looking at your variety of options and saying, this is the one that I much prefer. If you, quote, wait until the time comes, you've waited too long. And if you're sick, you might end up moving to a place that you don't want to be, only because that place has it's the only place that has a vacancy. So I strongly encourage families that are kind of teetering on that edge of moving and the necessity of moving to move sooner than later, because if you wait, then somebody else might make that decision for you and your choices are limited. Further, in some of the continuing care facilities like Richmond Place, the Lafayette, Fritz Farm, a number of them are the continuing care that Sarah Christian Village, that if once you are in that complex of, and they have assisted living or personal care and skilled nursing all on one campus, if you enter sooner and you become kind of a resident of that community, you can move through the different levels of care at that facility and end up in skilled care. But it's harder to get into skilled care from the outside if you're not already in that facility. Okay, so the people who've lived there longer have first dibs on the skilled nursing home beds. Does that make sense? So don't wait until the time comes. Really consider moving. And that's hard. That's a hard thing to bite off. It's a hard thing to bite off is, well, I'm not really ready yet. Well, believe me, moving before you're ready, or you think you're ready, or if you're even questioning if you're ready, is probably a good idea to investigate it. Some folks also think that the facilities that are licensed and will accept Medicaid don't offer as good a care as privately owned facilities, and I have found that that is not the case. I've been in some really beautiful private facilities that the care has been less than stellar. So don't let whether they accept or whether they're predominantly a Medicaid facility discourage you about the quality of care, because I have not found that to be the case. Now, most facilities are mandated, if they accept Medicare, they're mandated to have a certain number of Medicaid beds. So some of the very nice facilities will say, yes, we accept Medicaid. If you look on Medicare, Compare, they'll say, yes, they accept Medicaid. Well, they might have 3 or 4 beds, 3 or 4 skilled nursing beds for Medicaid. But again, the person who has already lived in that community the longest has first dibs on that. And those beds are usually filled by residents who've lived there who simply run out of money for the long term. So you need, in your planning, that's kind of how that works. If you want to really look at the quality of the nursing home, I encourage you to take a look at the Nursing Home Compare. If you look at look at Medicare.org and look at Nursing Home Compare, you can get the state inspectors' reports on various facilities and compare them. I think this is helpful, but it's not always the most up-to-date, but it will give you a sense of the history of the care at any given facility. So then when you're ready to move, I'm absolutely sure that you read the small print about what that you pay for, what you don't pay, when you can move, how to, I'll read the small print and understand that contract very, very carefully. Read that contract very, very carefully. And in many of the skilled nursing home contracts, admission papers, I encourage families not to sign the contingency that will allow you to mediate any kind of legal dispute. You do not want to give up your rights to sue the facility and go through mediation rather than a court hearing settlement. Do not give up your right. Look at that very carefully, because what often happens is, you enter a facility and they give you, a thick stack of papers. Know what it is you're signing. Be very, very careful there. So I have talked about a lot of stuff in a short amount of time. And so maybe this might be a good time to open for questions. Would that work okay if we want to unmute and chat? Do we have a administrator here that can unmute people? Or I guess you can unmute yourselves as well.
Yeah, you can unmute yourself. What is that 67 rule again?
Well, I call it,
kind of
yeah, I call it the 67% rule. And
percent rule. There you go.
that number is from data that's a bit dated, but I've called it that for a long time, and I think that number is probably pretty true. Primary caregivers have a 67% greater chance of death or disability due to caregiver stress compared to non-primary caregivers of the same age. So it's not unusual for the primary caregiver, just from the stress of caregiving, to burn out or get sick. And then the care receiver is the one who suffers because there's no one to take care of them. And caregiving is a shared responsibility.
And is that figure specific to non-paid caregivers, or does that include, for example, people who work in an assisted living facility as a paid caregiver?
It's more of a family caregiver situation.
Okay. That's what I thought, but I was just curious.
Well, you know, and even like I said, that data is a bit dated, but I use that rule to really, and that number to really stress that primary caregivers' needs count. Whether your loved one's in a facility or whether they're at home, you're still on all the time. You know, you're still available all the time. You are responsible all the time. So your needs count. And I really believe that the needs of the primary caregiver are every bit as important as the needs of the care receiver.
You mentioned a little bit ago dementia care and memory care.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a difference? Are there specific things that I should look for when it comes to dementia care specifically?
You know, again, dementia care is, I mean, because of the increasing incidence of Alzheimer's and related dementias, we have a lot more elders with that problem. And, you know, traditionally in nursing home care, the vast majority of the people had dementia or some kind of cognitive impairment. And we didn't talk about it so much, but now it's a marketing way of, you know, saying that we specialize in this. I think, you know, my piece of advice in terms of the memory care, depending on how critically impaired somebody is cognitively, if their medications are going to change quite a bit, or if they're impaired, you know, with behavior changes that the medication needs to be tweaked, you know, pretty frequently, I would recommend you consider personal care, because it's just going to be over the long haul easier to manage the medications because they can do that in-house rather than having you go to the pharmacy or call the pharmacy and having, you know, the meds changed and those kinds of things. You know, somebody with early dementia that can manage pretty well might do well at an assisted living, but there's going to come a time if that changes, you might need to, you know, boost the care level a little bit. One of the important things that you know, that's why I recommend that people start becoming familiar with the facilities now. And it's more difficult now because you can't go in and tour and have a meal and kind of get a, you know, a sense of what's happening. But to talk to other families, you know, just find out who else is out there and talk to other families about their experience there. There are a multitude of approaches now to dementia care. You know, there's the Teep of Snow, there's healing moments, there's a variety of approaches. And what approach do they use? Now, here's something also to ask in the dementia care, memory care units. And I think they call them memory care because nobody wants to use the word dementia because it's too scary, but they mean the same thing. Is how, if their caregivers have been trained, specifically trained in memory care.
Okay.
Because I'll tell you what, there are facilities that have memory care units and their employees have not been trained in dementia care. So sometimes dementia care or memory care just means that, you know, it's a locked unit that somebody can't wander out into the street or the yard or something, but their staff is no differently trained than the staff, say, on the, you know, on the general population unit. So be very careful and ask specifically how they are trained, how much training they have. And if you get no for an answer, then look someplace else. And ask for the documentation of that training too. Ask for the documentation. And another thing, in some of these places, you might also ask what their staff to client or resident ratio is. Again, depending on the complexity of the care you require. Because some of them, you know, might have a 1 to 5, some of them might have a 1 to 8. So if their staff are not well trained and they have a 1 to 8 ratio, you know, it's very different than a 1 to 5 with somebody who's been specifically trained.
I was wondering, for families that are planning ahead and talking through plans, what would be some guidelines that you would suggest for like a cutoff point of, okay, this is when it would be time to make the move to assisted living or personal care place?
As soon as you begin to ask the question, is it time? Become familiar with your various options, because anything can happen from a broken hip to an illness of a primary caregiver. So as soon as you are wondering if it's time, begin to investigate your options. That's the time. Now, there are things that I have said to clients, particularly the parents, you know, I don't want to move, you can't make me move, yada, yada, yada. I hear that a lot. And I say that because I've experienced, and I know the one day I tell my family, I say, the day that I say I'm not moving, you just take me by the hand and say, we're going to lunch today, Esther. And just do it. Because if you have your powers of attorney document set up and you are the power of attorney and your parent has entrusted you when they didn't have dementia for making the right decision for them as they were moving through that continuum, they trusted you to make that decision with them. It's not a power thing. I often say that I'm asking you to do this for your adult children because they worry about you, because they're missing work taking care of you, any number of reasons. But I would look as soon as, you know, as soon as you begin to answer the question of, let's go look at these together so we can decide together now, rather than have somebody that we don't know or we don't want to go in case of an emergency. One of the things that I often use is, and particularly this kind of time of year, is, boy, this would be a perfect time to move because winter's coming and it's, you know, it's just harder in the wintertime. And, you know, one thing that we use is, you know, let's try this for 6 months. We'll try it for 6 months. Because any of us, and then, you know, you don't make it sound like it's written in stone. Does that make sense? So begin to investigate your options earlier than later. One of the things I find that parents respond to is the cost, that they really don't have a really firm, good idea on the cost of how much it's gonna be to live at home. You know, they think, well, I'll just hire a college student to come and live with me, or, you know, somebody can come in, and it just doesn't work that way. What we find with home care from the agencies is they say that they can supply 4 hours of care a day, but then you've got a different person coming every day because no one wants to work for just 4 hours. They want full-time employment. So it's hard to schedule partial care per day. So if somebody needs 4 to 6 hours of care per day for, say, bathing and dressing and helping them prepare a meal, getting somebody consistently into a home for 4 to 6 hours a day without a swinging door and different caregivers coming and going and managing that, in addition to worrying about their care, is often a benchmark for saying, boy, it would just be a lot easier to live in a facility where everything's available to me in one place. And it might be less expensive.
Hey, Esther, you talked a little bit about resistance, you know, when you were saying, when you talk to families about, you know, your kids worry about you, they go to work and, you know, they have a hard time concentrating because there's dad doing. I happen to use that one on my dad, but what other tactics or not tactics, strategy things do you have for resistance when parents are like, no, I'm going out of here feet first?
Well, you know, I've been accused of being, of lacking tact. But sometimes I just think you need to pull out the stops and say, look, you know, you're being unfair. And we are not conditioned to talk to our parents like that. I mean, some families are, they fight a lot, but, you know, I can't do it. You know, it's unfair to me. It doesn't mean I don't love you and that I don't care about you, because love is not measured in whether or not I can do this for you. That's not how we measure love. So I'm asking you to work with me to make this decision. So if anything happens to me, somebody that you do not want making decisions for you won't be making decisions for you. And so sometimes I just think pulling out the stops and being real frank about it can be helpful. At the same time, you might preface that with, you know what, I don't blame you a bit for staying at home. I want you to stay at home too. You know, I hear you. I want the same thing, but it's just not possible. Because then they know they've been heard, that they're scared, that they're worried, that you feel the same way. You hear that. But the reality is, we need to make a change. We need to make a change. So sometimes I just think having that frank discussion is a, you know, way to go. Now, the flip side of that too is that if you meet with such resistance that it becomes impossible without their compliance and help you making that decision, is you make a decision and a plan without them. So when the time comes, when they fall down the steps or when they have an injury or whether, you know, that disaster or crisis hits, you yourself have that roadmap. You know what facilities you want picked out. You know, you have a lay of the land. So when that time comes, you know which direction to head and not spin your wheels wondering what would be best. So you go ahead and investigate whether they want to come with you or not. And I will tell you from personal experience, you know, my mom did that. She said, I am not moving. You cannot make me. And my dad, in his wisdom, found the place that he thought would be best for them. She would not go with him. She wouldn't look at that with him. But he knew. And so when he got sick and we needed to move her because there was no one at home to take care of her, we knew exactly where to go. And that saved us a boatload of heartache because we already knew. And it will keep you from spinning your wheels in something that probably won't work. Terry, you're
mute button. Thank you for sharing.
Anybody else have any specific questions or?
Esther, I do. Can you? This is Christy Yon with Bluegrass Care Navigators. How are you?
Yeah, hi, Christy.
Yeah, I'm sitting with my mother and have a question about. I think the most difficult situation we're in right now is that my stepfather is much more progressed with dementia, and my mother is very youthful, and it almost makes me feel like if they try to find a place to live together right now, is almost punishing her. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And, you know, that's, yeah, and that's really a heartbreaking place to be.
Yeah, because she has
A life, a different kind.
exactly.
Yeah, she has a life. She has a life too.
Yeah.
You know, at the real core of some of these decisions, I think, and this is just, I'm a minister too. It's just my perception is that how we are conditioned to measure love. Caring about somebody is different than caring for somebody. And caregiving is meant to be shared. It's not meant to be done by one person. So, you know, I remember saying to my own mom, we need to move you, but this doesn't mean we love you any less. Because I think some of our motivation for moving or not moving somebody is based on that perception of we move them, they're going to hate us, or they're going to think I love them less, when that's not true. So sometimes that opening that discussion or just saying that out loud can help. And, you know, of course now with COVID, it makes it so much more difficult to visit and all of those other kinds of things. But what I'm also finding is in some of the facilities, they're using creative ways of maintaining that contact, whether it's through Zoom or, you know, window visits or any number of things. So I don't know that I have a specific answer other than saying that her needs count and it's not a measure of love. Do we want it to end where, you know, they're separate? No. But in reality, COVID or no COVID, whatever happens, that might just be the outcome of any marriage, that they can't be together, whether we like it or not. So how do we demonstrate our love and concern for somebody in that circumstance other than just saying it and understanding that difference? Does that make a bit of sense?
It does. Yeah, it does. And thank you.
Because again, if anything happens to her, and it will, you know, one of my favorite stories from years ago was one of my really favorite clients named Jeffy, and she was well into her 90s. You know, she lived in personal care. She got too sick. I mean, she was hospitalized and she got too sick to move back to personal care, which meant she needed to move to skilled nursing. So she needed to give up her apartment as she knew it and her life as she knew it in her little community. And I was just sick for her. And I just said, Jeffy, I am so sorry you can't move back, you know, to your home. I'm sorry that you can't move back to your little apartment. And I will never forget this. She said, you know, Esther, I'm 97 years old and all I've been doing for 97 years is change. And I can change again. I about fell off my chair. And that happened about 25 years ago, that conversation. And I've never forgotten that, because I think we can all learn from that. Is this, we're learning that now, in COVID, it's just not turning out like we expected. But without COVID, the same thing is true. Sometimes it just doesn't turn out like we want it to turn out. So we just need to fill in the gaps of how it doesn't turn out the way we want it to minimize the trauma. We can't make it perfect, but we can minimize the trauma. Anybody else?
I'd like to, may I? I'd like to just respond to the situation where one spouse has much more dementia than the other. That would be a good situation for the couple to be in a continuing care retirement community.
Absolutely. Yep. And that's a very good option, because if one person can be on the same campus, but just down a tunnel or a hallway, or go over to visit. The difficulty, I mean, and that's a great solution by all means. The problem is sometimes just the matter of being able to afford 2 different levels of care, and that's often the financial constraint for some families in making that balance. But again, the continuing care facility is a good way of being able to pull that off. Yeah. Anybody else?
Have anything else for Esther? I think this was really good. I really enjoyed you listening to, minimizing the trauma, defining what love is. I mean, that stuff's really important when it comes down to caregiving and making these decisions and feeling guilty and all that other stuff that goes with it. So thank you so much, Esther, for sharing your time with us.
I think one of the things that I've learned too is, I've been doing this for 25 years. And so my perceptions have changed in 25 years, because now I'm 65. I'm going to be 65 in a couple of months. And I think I don't want to be one of those people that say, you can't make me move. I want to be one of those people that can say, how can I help you help me? Knowing that life isn't going to turn out. Now, I mean, that's the kind of person I want to be. I think that's just going to take some intentional practice.
Now, is that going to be what's happened, or is that what you want?
Yeah, right. But just to be aware that, that's kind of my plan.
What you want to do. I know I've told my girls that same thing, it's like, just do it. I trust your instincts.
Well, and one of the things that I've said to my clients, and I know it's just about one here, but I said, in this tug of war conversation of, you can't make me, I don't want to go, I'm sad, is that particularly if a parent has more advanced dementia, that they can't understand why they need to move. I say, you've been entrusted with the necessity of moving, you just move, and that's a different conversation. Because if they understood the necessity of moving, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So, and then you just need to do what needs to be done. And also for some primary caregivers, I say, if your mom in her normal state of mind, when she entrusted you to her care, was listening to the angst of your conversation with me, what do you think she'd tell you? And sometimes, the response is, my mother would say, do exactly as she says, no matter what the circumstance, that's just the kind of person she is. But most often the response is, she'd say, do what needs to be done to protect me and to keep me safe. So that's also another way of conceptualizing having to make some of these decisions.
This caregiving thing is hard, so.
It is hard. Yes, it is.
Kudos to all the caregivers out there.
Yep. All right.
Well, thank you, Esther. I appreciate
You're very welcome. Thanks for asking me.
Yeah.
All
If
right.
anybody has questions, you can type it in the chat box or just email me, and I can always forward it on to Esther too if you have anything later.
All right.
So.
Appreciate it. Thanks you all. Bye-bye.